and welcome to another episode of TDNY. This day, not year. The podcast that looks back at the history of the week ahead. This episode will be looking at history from the 12th of May to the 18th. Coincidentally, this is also episode 18 of TDNY. And on this 18th episode, we'll learn such things as which Pope didn't get his coffee, the cosmic entity that many thought would wipe out life on Earth, America's attempt at life off Earth, and one way to not stop a runaway train, plus a whole lot more along the way. So stick around as we look back at 7 brand new old stories from history, pair each one with a fitting song, and then finish off with a quiz, just to see if you've been paying attention. But enough preamble, let's kick things off with Monday, May 12th. On this day, not year, a papal shish kebab was narrowly avoided. Just recently, in the Vatican City, a new pope has been elected after the passing of Pope Francis. The new guy, Pope Leo XIV, is the 267th to take on the role, at least as far as we know, since Herman of Reichenau, or Herman the Cripple, a Benedictine monk, started listing them down in the 11th century. Ironically, his last entry is for Pope Leo IX. While Leo XIV may be the 267th, he was very nearly the 268th. Karol Joseph Wojtyła was born 18th of May 1920 in Poland. In his youth, he was a keen soccer player and actor on the stage. For Karol, things seemed to always come in twos. In 1940, he suffered a pair of devastating accidents. Struck by a tram and nearly dying, he escaped with a fractured skull, which apparently had the strange side effect of improving his memory. Only shortly after to also be struck by a moving lorry truck, this time leaving him with a lifelong stoop, and hopefully a deeper appreciation for roadside safety. 2 years later, as World War II raged on, he started studying to become a priest. Years later, while away on a kayaking trip, he was made an auxiliary bishop, then a titular bishop, before Pope Paul VI appointed him archbishop in 1964, making his way to cardinal in 1967. Then, in 1978, Karol Joseph Wojtyła became the first non-Italian in 455 years to become the Pope, assuming the name of Pope John Paul II. He was also the second Pope elected that year, Pope John Paul I lasting just 35 days, before a heart attack took him before he could even touch his morning coffee September 29th, 1978. So, 4 years pass, until May 12, 1982 rolls around. John Paul II was in Portugal, visiting the Shrine of Fatima, a place that pilgrims had flocked to over the prior 65 years. On May 13, 1917, 3 children had been out in the countryside when, as the story goes, a divine apparition of a woman, an angel calling herself the Lady of the Rosary, appeared, and over the coming months would impart prophecies to the children, who came to call the apparition Our Lady of Fatima, although they also knew her by another name too, the Virgin Mary. All this culminated in what has since been termed the Miracle of the Sun, when, in October, an estimated 70,000 people gathered on the words of the 3 children, and report they witnessed a miracle of the sun zigzagging across the sky, and changing in luminosity, the ground turning blue, clothes being wet one moment and dried again the next, as well as a few other miraculous events throughout the day, for good measure. Over the years, statues of Mary were built in the area, as were buildings or basilicas dedicated to the Lady of Fatima and as a place for pilgrims to gather, which is where we find Pope John Paul II on this day back in 1982. Suddenly, from the gathered crowd, a voice cries out, "Down with the Pope! Down with Vatican II!" And a man wielding a bayonet, sans rifle, charges out at the Pope. Security, as news would report, were able to intervene in time, wrestling the man down and marching him off to jail, with the New York Times headline reading, "Pope unhurt as man menaces him at Portugal shrine." Continuing, "The Pope was not hurt. He blessed the assailant, then continued a ceremony for a gathering of 1 million people that was drawing to a close when the attack occurred." Only the charge had struck home, and the Pope was punctured. Rather than jumping up, pumping a fist and posing for the cameras, the Pope hid the wound, carried on, and was quietly seen to after, a fact that only came to light many years later. The attacker, one Juan Maria Fernandez y Crone, was a Spanish priest, a traditionalist, who opposed changes made during the Second Vatican Council of 1962 to 1965 that finalized attempts to modernize much of the Catholic Church. Crone would go on to serve 6 years in jail. But, as I hinted at earlier, things for Pope John Paul II came in pairs, and this was actually the conclusion of that pair. He was at the Fatima Shrine to give his thanks for an event that occurred 364 days prior, on the day, not year, of March 13th, when a gunman opened fire on him in St. Peter's Square in the Vatican City, firing 4 times and striking the Pope-mobile-mounted Pope twice, once in the hand and once in the torso. Pope John Paul II, despite these attempts, would go on to live until the age of 84, passing away in 2005. A pick from left field for this pairing, coming from the soundtrack to a video game, Borgia, The Rulers of Rome, by Jesper, from the Assassin's Creed Brotherhood soundtrack. While only loosely based on reality, the game features an assassination plot against a pope, Borgia, and I feel it's a fitting enough connection to our story today. Tuesday, May 13th. On this day, not year, we see C/1861 J1. Today, if you look up into the night sky, it's not uncommon to see movement. From planes and other vehicles blinking by, to strings of satellites circling the Earth far above them. Or, if like Mulder, you want to believe, even lights from UAPs zipping by. Of course, this is all supposing that light pollution hasn't washed away the ability to see anything at all. If you go back in time, before man-made satellites, before planes, and before cities were lit 24/7, seeing objects moving about the heavens could bring much excitement, which was the case with a comet in our story today. If you can cast your mind all the way back to episode 1, you may remember me telling you this. An asteroid is a large rocky object that orbits the Sun, and tends to skew between pebble and small planet size. Meanwhile, a meteor is a smaller piece that has broken off from an asteroid and taken an unhealthy interest in our little blue planet. If it burns up before it gets to us, it's a meteor. If it survives that fall, a meteorite. What I left out at the time, however, was a definition for a comet. Much like the orbiting asteroid, a comet also circles the Sun in our solar system. Unlike an asteroid, however, it isn't a large, rocky object. Instead, comets are a mix of ice and dust. The mesmerizing tale that we associate with comets is due to their composition. As the ice melts away, vaporized into a gas, it leaves that streak of material behind it, trailing along. With all this in mind, we venture down to Windsor, formerly Green Hills, in New South Wales, Australia. Claimed as the fourth oldest settlement of British occupation in Australia, and just 56 kilometres or 31 miles from Sydney, today it's a quiet town, home to a lot of old architecture and buildings, including one of the few remaining Pizza Huts. But our story today doesn't concern modern times, or Pizza Hut, but instead a man named John Tebbutt, BBT. John, 1834 to 1916, grew up in Windsor, as did his father, John Tebbutt, a storekeeper, while his father, John Tebbutt, was an early settler in the area. John, that is John Jr., took up watching the stars at age 19. Armed with a basic ship's telescope, he took up watch from his home just out of town. It was 1861, on this day, May 13th, that all of John's stargazing came to fruition. In his own words, from a letter published in the Herald newspaper, "I was engaged in my accustomed examination of the night on the 13th of May, when a faint, nebulous object in the constellation Eridanus, a few minutes of a degree northwest of the star known as 1316 of Lacaille, attracted my attention." I'll skip over some sextant talk, lamenting over his telescope, and searching through a catalogue of some 9,766 stars, as John continued. "I entertained hopes of the object proving to be a comet. My next step was to determine its cometary character by change of position." Which, sure enough, after days of observation, it was determined to be in motion, and be a comet. John estimated that on the night of his discovery, the comet was 124 million miles from Earth and just 96 million miles from the Sun. While news spread around the southern hemisphere of John's discovery, the comet reached the northern hemisphere before word from down under could reach them. The spectacle was noted down by many, as the comet was now visible with the naked eye, and leaving a fan-shaped tail behind it. "By the appearance of the tail, there is reason to infer that it is approaching the sun at an inconceivable rate. I think by the cut of her jib, she will probably be remembered, and also recorded, as one of the most extraordinary craft that has floated into our horizon for hundreds of years," Mr. Bradley of the Allegheny Observatory reported in July. As the comet passed over, some were even able to observe the shadow of it passing, displayed along the ground and walls. It wasn't all wonder and spectacle, however, as one story, out of Victoria, Australia, tells of a woman believing it to be the end of the world, and she rushed off to settle a medical debt, wanting to be squared away before the comet crashed and ended all life. This hasn't been the only comet-related panic. In 1910, perhaps the most famous of comets, Halley's, caused a short-lived panic when scientists of the day discovered cyanogen gas, a deadly compound not too dissimilar from cyanide, present in the comet's tail. Ignoring the fact that Halley's Comet had been noted circling around us since 87 BC with no mass casualty event, many were certain this spelled doom for the planet. A New York Times article titled "Comet's Poisonous Tail" stated, "The fact that cyanogen is present in the comet has been communicated to Camille Flammarion and many other astronomers, and is causing much discussion as to the probable effect on the Earth should it pass through the comet's tail. Professor Flammarion is of the opinion that the cyanogen gas would impregnate the atmosphere and possibly snuff out all life on the planet." Whoever said Fox News had a copyright on fear-mongering? As Halley's Comet grew closer, doctors fielded calls from worried people, wondering if the gas would get to everyone at once, or if it would travel from city to city, slowly coating the world. While stories of people attempting to gas-proof their homes flooded newspapers, one woman quoted as saying, "I have stopped all the windows and doors in my flat to keep the gas out. All the other women in the building think it is a good thing and are all doing the same." Some even took their efforts further, bricking up their homes with the intention to shut out all outside airflow and survive through the night aided by oxygen canisters. As Earth crossed through the tail of Halley's Comet, I imagine many held their breath, waiting only to release it when they realized that no one was falling down dead. Well, nearly no one. A group had gathered on the roof of a 4-story apartment building in Brooklyn when the glass of an air shaft gave way beneath 16-year-old Amy Hopkins, and she fell to her death. As for C/1861 J1, or Tebbutt's Comet, it passed Earth by, disappearing from eyesight by August and vanishing from telescope range by May of 1862. However, it won't be the last we ever see of it. Although not as frequent as Halley's, Tebbutt's Comet will return again too. If you're around in the year 2267, you can see the return of what was coined the Great Comet of 1861. My song pairing for this story comes from a London-based band that Wikipedia describes as incorporating elements of jazz, electronica, funk, and psychedelic rock. Forming in 2013, they took their name from a BBC radiophonic workshop of sound effects. End of Earth, by the band The Comet is Coming. Wednesday, May 14th. On this day, not year, science in space. If you can remember back to episode 6 of this podcast, you may remember a story about the Sea Lab, an underwater research station sunk to the bottom of the sea off the coast of Bermuda in 1964. It was during the time of the space race, with countries and scientists looking for new frontiers to conquer and learn from, and exploit the natural resources of. Well, on this day, not year, America got the trifecta. They'd had land labs, they'd been through a few sea labs, and now they were launching a Skylab. The goals of Skylab, as per NASA, were 1. Prove that humans could live and work in space for extended periods of time. An astronaut aboard the first crew stating, "The day will come when a skilled medical researcher will enter a space transport vehicle, coast up to an orbiting space station, be shown his quarters, and go to work in his laboratory." And 2. Expand our knowledge of solar astronomy well beyond Earth-based observations. A quote from the History of Skylab on nasa.gov states, "Skylab served as the greatest solar observatory of its time, a microgravity lab, a medical lab, an Earth-observing facility." Weighing in at 90,000 kilograms, or a little under 200,000 pounds, the Skylab was 117 feet long and 90 feet wide. That's 35 by 27 meters. Although the inhabitable area was less than that, the bulk of the livable space was taken up by the OWS, or Orbital Workshop, a module containing equipment for an array of scientific tests that were to be conducted while the astronauts were aboard. It also housed continuing experiments that had been launched up with Skylab, some of which were a French ultraviolet experiment, and one simply called Skylab Student Experiment ED52, which, for anyone with arachnophobia, was focused on web formation in a weightless environment. In other words, spiders in space. Truly terrifying, but also the premise of an excellent science fiction book by Adrian Tchaikovsky, Children of Time. But I digress. Many of the other experiments were centered around life in space and how it would affect humans. From muscle loss to heart health, weight and dizziness. In total, Skylab had nearly 100 different experiments and instruments on board. Not that kind of instrument, the scientific kind. Much like Sealab eventually had, Skylab also contained all the comforts one would want in a home away from home. A hot shower that functioned by pulling a cylindrical shower curtain from the floor and attaching it to the ceiling, whereupon a vacuum system is used to suck away excess water. Although you really needed some free time, as it took around 2.5 hours to safely use the shower. A comfortable bed was also present, although it was essentially a telephone booth-sized compartment with a sleeping bag strapped in vertically. This was also another experiment, to see how space would affect sleep. And bad news for anyone looking for a short-term stay. The study found the astronauts had an overall decrease in total sleep time, but an increase in stage 4, or recovery, sleep, although this seemed to even out the longer a person was in space. All of this doesn't come cheap, however, with one Australian newspaper awkwardly stating it cost $2,600 million. If you can't work that number into something more manageable, that's $2.6 billion. The launch, on May 14th, 1973, was uncrewed. And while a success, it wasn't perfect. When it arrived in space, a command was sent for it to unfurl its solar panels. Only it wasn't getting the expected solar power readings, and the inside was slowly starting to heat up. The trio of astronauts were supposed to go up to Skylab the day after launch, but with these new complications, NASA had to rush through brainstorming a solution to make sure they weren't sending the crew up for failure. 11 days later, they launched 2, and after many failed docking attempts, eventually managed it, deploying the NASA-approved fix, and all was good. The trio spent the next 28 days aboard Skylab before returning to Earth. Another group went up in July, staying 59 days, while a third group in November spent 84 days in the lab. As a throwback to our last story, this third crew were also the first humans to witness a comet from space. Another group was planned, but as the third group were leaving, they were told to power things down. Skylab was showing its age at 172 days old, and many components were starting to fail and supplies were getting low. Although hopes were for others to eventually inhabit the station, those hopes were never realized. The orbit of Skylab started to decay, and by 1979, it was coming home. Kind of. While much interest and worry initially surrounded where the 90-ton Skylab would land, some instead turned it into a way to gamble or saw it as a business opportunity, selling t-shirts and other Skylab-themed tat, like a repellent spray. Eventually, it was calculated that Australia would be the lucky crash pad. Orbit number 34,980 saw it travel just south of Adelaide, but its final orbit, 34,981, brought it over, and then down on, Western Australia, fortunately landing in a mostly unpopulated area about 480 kilometres east of Perth. The Shire of Esperance, one of the locations peppered by debris, jokingly issued NASA a $400 fine for littering. It was paid in 2009 as a radio stunt. The song pairing for this story is from Shiny Toy Guns, and their cover of song Major Tom Coming Home, the unofficial sequel to David Bowie's Space Oddity, written by German musician Peter Schilling. Thursday, May 15th. On this day, not year, CSX 8888 went for a little unsupervised jaunt. Have you ever watched Thomas and Friends? It was created, then continued on by father and son duo Wilbert Audrey and Christopher Audrey as the Railway series, first debuting May 12, 1945. The show, and books, centre around a crew of anthropomorphic trains that happily puff puff chuff chuff around the island of Sodor. Our story today isn't all too dissimilar, although instead of a happy choo-choo like Thomas, going about under its own steam and sentience, we have a very real, very inanimate train loose on the American rails. Around midday, May 15th, 2001, an employee of the Ohio-based CSX Transportation Railroad Company was traversing through a rail yard when he spotted a problem. He needed to switch tracks, but the switch that was needed for that wasn't aligned correctly. Now, he could stop the train, change the switch to the correct track, and carry on, but it had been raining, and the tracks were slippery, and he reasoned that the train wouldn't be able to brake in time. So, instead, new plan. Set the train to slowly brake, jump off the slowing train, run forward, flip the switch, run back, and jump on again. Simple. Only if it were simple, we wouldn't be hearing about it today. The driver made one mistake. He never put the brakes on. Instead, he accidentally hit the throttle, speeding the train up. Jumping out, the unnamed driver tried to clamber back onto the train, but the rain from earlier prevented him. He slipped, was dragged 80 feet, and fell. The train now free to roam, unshackled from the cruel reins of man. Or something like that. What made this worse was this wasn't just an engine singular on the loose. No, it was an entire freight train with 47 cars attached. While half were empty, it also contained 2 cars carrying liquid phenol, a compound that can cause chemical burns if exposed to the skin, and is an ingredient in explosives. When heated, the vapor phenol produces is also explosive in fairly low quantities when exposed to the air. Just as a fun aside. So, the train picked up speed and carried on its merry way. It was able to reach up to 50 miles per hour, or 80 kilometers per hour, which is a heck of a lot of potential energy it was carrying. In 1896, 2 trains carrying just 6 empty boxcars each had a head-on collision going at 45 miles per hour, and apparently collided with enough force to bring the horizontal trains together like a vertical zip before toppling over and promptly exploding from boiler breaches, just like our Mississippi steamer from episode 15. But back to CSX 8888. At first it was believed by those that witnessed the train that the engineer must have suffered a heart attack and was either dead or dying at the controls. But eventually the truth came to light. In the words of Kathleen Burns, a spokeswoman for CSX, the train left its Toledo rail yard with no engineer at its controls. The engineer was nearby in the yard at the time, but not on the train. Now, imagine you're in this situation. A runaway train. No driver in sight. is slowly picking up speed as it travels, unsupervised, across America and through population centers. A potential disaster if it crashes into anything at the speed it's going and the momentum it's carrying. How do you stop the train? If you answered, shoot it, you're on the money. abcnews.go.com reports. At one point, a sheriff's deputy tried to stop the train by shooting its fuel tank. Unfortunately, this isn't an action movie. Yet. And so this didn't work. No, just as Talking Heads sang in 1983, fighting fire with fire, CSX needed to fight trains with trains. And so, a second train was speeding along behind CSX 8888 and was able to couple to it and apply their brakes to start slowing the trains down. The train slowed further as it reached an incline, and a CSX employee was able to jump on and finally shut the Runaway down. If this story sounded familiar, or you thought my wording around this not being an action movie yet seems strange, well, there are reasons for that. 9 years later, in 2010, a movie starring Denzel Washington and Chris Pine was released. Unstoppable, which IMDb.com describes thusly. With an unmanned half-mile-long freight train barreling towards the city, a veteran engineer and young conductor race against the clock to prevent a catastrophe. Mark Bombach, the writer for the movie, based it loosely, very loosely, on the events from our story today. A couple of obvious choices here. And while Postmodern Jukebox's cover of Crazy Train is a personal favourite, I think the simplicity of Soul Asylum's Runaway Train wins out here. Friday, May 16th. On this day, not year, bean brewing took a leap forward. If you believe the legend, coffee was discovered back in Ethiopia by a goat herder when he noticed his flock full of vim and vigour after consuming a berry from a certain bush. An abbot from a nearby monastery then supposedly got a hold of the beans, discovered roasting. Some variations have him declare the beans evil, throwing them into a fire, thus roasting them, before the smell has him, or another, grab them out again. They were then mashed together with some hot water and gulped down as the first proto-coffee. True or not, fortunately for many around the world, coffee has evolved greatly over the years. Early methods of brewing up a coffee involved steeping grounds in hot water, sometimes for hours at a time, resulting in a deeply bitter drink. The 1500s to 1600s saw some evolution. The Ibrik method from Turkey introduced quicker brewing, sugars and spices, and a drink more palatable. However, this Turkish style did not include any filter, and if you weren't careful, you would end up with a mouthful of grounds, which isn't the most pleasant experience. Europe used a longer spouted coffee pot to help keep the grounds grounded and out of the finished drink when poured. The French, in the 1700s, took this even further by treating the ground coffee more like a tea and sealing it in a linen bag for brewing, keeping all the grounds contained. The early 1800s started to see multi-chamber contraptions for letting water drip through coffee grounds. One, more like an egg timer, you had to turn upside down once the water in the bottom chamber had boiled, so it could start dripping down through the beans. From there, devices that would instead push the water up through the grounds instead were also introduced, similar to a mocha pot today. While all of this is coffee, it still isn't what most of us would call coffee today. For that, we need espresso. But just what is the difference? Well, Coffee is any old drink made from roasted and ground coffee beans, while espresso is a particular style of creating coffee. So, let me introduce the star of this story, Angelo Moriondo. Born 1851 in what is now Turin, Italy, but was then Turin, Kingdom of Sardinia, and would soon be Turin, capital city of Italy. Angelo came from a family of food and beverage entrepreneurs, a grandfather in the liqueur trade, and a father and brother with a chocolate business. Angelo, in his 30s, had 2 hotels to his name, but that's not why we remember him today. Angelo created what is considered by many to be the first espresso coffee machine, the patent for which was approved on this day in 1884, stating it was for new steam machinery for the economic and instantaneous confection of coffee beverage. So, why don't we see Angelo Moriondo machines for sale today, amongst the Rancilios, Lilits, Gagagias, La Marzoccos, and the like? Well, 2 reasons. The first, these machines had a very limited run. Only a few were made, and done so exclusively for his own hotels and businesses. He hoped there'd be enough of a draw to bring people to him, rather than bring the machine to the people. The second reason? Well, it may have been the first espresso machine, but that doesn't mean it was great. As per an article on SmithsonianMag.com, the machine was more of a batch brewer than something that would ensure a quality single serve per customer, and it could only reach 1.5 bars of pressure. What does pressure matter when brewing coffee, you may be asking? Well, and go along with me here. Think of ground coffee like a dirty driveway. Appealing, no? You can wash it with a hose, and it will still be dirty at the end of the day. But if you use a pressure washer, that dirt and grime is blasted away, which is basically what the pressure does with espresso. Forces out all of the internal oils and particulates that give off the taste and smell of coffee that we love. Most places will swear by 9 bars of pressure being the required range for espresso, a lot more than Angelo's 1.5. Although some in the 4th wave of the coffee movement are starting to experiment with lower pressures too. Either way, next time you're having a coffee, raise your glass to Angelo and all those like him, as without those inventors, we wouldn't have coffee as we know it today. I love Java, sweet and hot. Whoops, Mr. Moto, I'm a coffee pot. A line crooned out by the Ink Spots, and their cover of Java Jive, a caffeine love song in a way. Saturday, May 17th. On this day, not year, somebody's been playing too much GTA. Our story today highlights the importance of keeping your vehicle, no matter the size, safely locked away when not in use. Sean Timothy Nelson was born August 21st, 1959 in California. At 19, he enlisted in the army, was stationed in Germany as a tank commander, but was discharged 2 years later over what an unidentified army official described as multifaceted disciplinary problems. After leaving the army, Nelson faced many ups and downs. He married in 1984, but was divorced in 1991. He became a prospector in search of gold, in his own backyard. He got into motorbikes, but fractured his spine in a crash. He became a plumber, driving a van with the license plate KANFIX, Can Fix. Then the van and his tools were stolen. These may have been some of the reasons why he turned to drug use. But unfortunately, this just caused his life to spiral further. And by 1995, He was unemployed, his utilities shut off, and was facing eviction. Unfortunately, nobody knows why he took these next actions. We only know that he did take them. At 6:30 p.m., Nelson, shirtless and in sweatpants, drove up to a San Diego-based National Guard armory. He walked inside and headed towards an M60A3 tank, weighing in at just under 60 tons, able to reach speeds of up to 72 kilometers or 45 miles per hour, and sporting a 105mm M68 cannon. The M60A3, once it gets going, is just about unstoppable. Fortunately, the tank Nelson walked up to was locked, as was the one next to it. Unfortunately, the third one he tried was just right, and Nelson jumped on in and started it up. At 6:45 p.m., he drove out of the armory, straight through the gate, and over the next 25 minutes would go on a nationally televised rampage. Almost nothing escaped his spree, driving over 40 parked or abandoned cars, flattening them. He crashed into electricity pylons and caused a power outage that affected 5,000 people. Fire hydrants, traffic lights, benches, and other infrastructure didn't escape his touch either. At one stage, attempting to bring down a bridge by ramming the pillars. All the while, a Blues Brothers-esque fleet of police gave chase, unable to stop him. All they could do was follow along. Over the course of the rampage, nobody was killed by Sean, although he did harry a few occupied vehicles, causing great emotional distress to their occupants. Eventually, he got the tank onto a freeway, forcing cars to swerve around him or speed away from him. This all came to an end when he tried to drive across to the other side of the freeway, but lost a track and got the tank stuck between the dividing concrete barrier. 4 police officers were then able to board the tank, open the hatch, and order Sean to surrender, an act he didn't comply with, forcing one to end his spree and his life. The bullet passed through his shoulder and into his body, killing him. A coroner noted that his blood alcohol level was double the legal limit. Despite all the damage caused, the bill wasn't as high as you might expect. The National Guard, and thus the state, was found responsible for the overall bill, paying just under $150,000 in damages, with $40,000 of that going to gas and electric companies. Ultimately, if the National Guard had implemented better safety procedures, none of this would have happened. So, as I mentioned at the top, remember to lock up after yourself. No stop signs. Speed limit. Nobody's going to slow me down. I think this is our first AC/DC pairing so far, but knowing their catalogue, it likely won't be the last. My pairing for this story is Highway to Hell by AC/DC. Sunday, May 18th. On this day, not year, a captain is named. Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission, to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before. Yes, we're talking Star Trek, created by Gene Roddenberry, born 1921. Gene was a writer by profession, working on scripts for television. His big break came in 1963, writing for his own show, The Lieutenant. Although finding critical acclaim later, it only lasted 1 season at the time, perhaps due to the criticism it faced when portraying a black soldier and a white soldier as equals. So, with the Lieutenant discharged from television, he was free to work on a new idea. As per Wikipedia, this included his ship location from Hawaii Passage and added a Horatio Hornblower character, plus the multiracial crew from his airship idea. It was decided as a science fiction show, and in April 1964, he settled on the name Star Trek. But he hadn't settled on a name for the main character, his Horatio Hornblower stand-in. By May 18th, 1964, he had narrowed it down to a list of 16. January, Flag, Drake, Christopher, Thorpe, Richard, Patrick, Raintree, Boone, Hudson, Timber, Hamilton, Hannibal, Neville, Kirk, and North. And as we all know now, Star Trek follows the adventures of Captain Kirk. This hasn't been the only time in history a writer has been stuck on a name. Our frustrated host from episode 17, Charles Dickens, had several choices for his character of Tiny Tim in A Christmas Carol. Little Larry, Puny Pete, and Small Sam. I'm sure he felt Dwarf David and Midget Michael were a little too on the nose. Or, for another science fiction example, today we know of the Jedi Knight Luke Skywalker, but originally he was to be Star Killer. And it was only the Manson family murders that saw the name changed to avoid any wordplay associations. A BBC.com article titled Surprising Secrets of Writers' First Book Drafts from 2020 notes a few other famous name changes. For instance, Gone with the Wind's Scarlett O'Hara was originally called Pansy. Arthur Conan Doyle's deer-stalker-wearing detective answered to Sharon Ford Hope. And the Great Gatsby's Daisy and Nick were Ada and Dud. If you know of any other famous fictional name changes, drop them down in the comments below. A tough choice for a song pairing for this story, but in the end, and I think rather fittingly, I went with a television show theme song. Sung by Gary Portnoy, the theme from Cheers, also known as Where Everybody Knows Your Name. Which brings us to the end of the week, but not the end of the episode, as now we have the quiz. Let's see how much attention you've been paying. Right, pens and paper at the ready. Question 1 from Monday. What were the 2 activities I mentioned that Pope John Paul II enjoyed in his youth? Question 2, Tuesday. Comets, dear listener, are mostly made up of what? Question 3 for Wednesday. How much did the Shire of Esperance jokingly fine NASA for the Skylab litter? Question 4 for Thursday. Where do Thomas the Tank Engine and his friends live? Question 5 for Friday, and it's a 2-parter. What is the standard pressure for brewing espresso? And what did Angelo's machine reach? Question 6 for Saturday. What was Sean Nelson's plumber-themed vanity license plate? And finally, question 7 for Sunday. Today we know him as Sherlock Holmes. But what was his original surname going to be? Right, got something down for each of them? Feel free to rewind and listen to the questions again if need be. But for now, let's go to the answers. Answer 1 for Monday. Pope John Paul II was a keen soccer player and stage actor in his youth. Answer 2 for Tuesday. Comets are mostly ice and dust. Answer 3 for Wednesday. NASA was fined $400 for littering at Skylab across Western Australia. Answer 4 for Thursday. Thomas and friends, of course, live on the island of Sodor. Answer 5 for Friday. 9 bars is the standard, and Angelo, with the first espresso machine, could only reach 1.5 bars of pressure. Answer 6 for Saturday. Sean Nelson's number plate read KANFIX, or Can Fix. And answer 7 for Sunday. Sherlock Holmes was originally Hope, Sharonford Hope. Which brings us to both the end of the quiz and the end of this episode. I hope you've come away with some new knowledge, or at the very least had a good time along the way. If you did enjoy yourself, and you're feeling particularly extroverted today, sharing this podcast with friends or family helps it grow and reach a wider audience. That said, if all you want to do is instead rate the podcast, that helps too. If you want to get in touch with me, or point out any horrible mistakes I've made, I can be reached on thisdaynotyear@gmail.com, providing my spam filter hasn't gained sentience again and started gatekeeping contact. But that's all from me, Adam, for this episode. And I hope you'll tune in again next week, where we'll be looking at the 19th to the 25th of May. So until then, I hope you stay well and have an historic week. Goodbye.